Ladies and gentlemen, greet you. Cheers. Except for strong. Today we want to deal with a phenomenon that isn't so easy to explain. I could refer to it with the simple term loss of the middle, but it's about something much more concrete, namely the actual loss of a kind of civic middle due to the widening into two large opposites, what I call in AI the ingenious spreading. And as I've noticed recently, there's a beautiful, very practical, political and social example for this, and that is the three-class voting system. That means more precisely not the three-class voting system, but the downfall of it. Because the downfall of it indicates exactly this transition into a spread society, or a polarized society. Let's just dive in, and you'll notice as I go along what it's all about. What is the three-class voting system, to begin with? This is a very typical census voting system of the 19th century, enforced in 1848 against the Prussian king for the second chamber of the Prussian parliament. You know about census voting from ancient Greece. Only the 500 wealthy citizens, the one-year term of the basileus. So the one-year basileus, I believe, is called something else, to take it on at all. And this is, so to speak, active voting rights. And here we have passive voting rights. So when we've talked about democracy, it's always been about census voting rights. And where does the idea come from? Well, it's quite simple. They say that those who contribute a lot to the state, meaning through taxes, should also have a particularly strong voice in how the money they've paid in is mostly spent by the state. So first of all, a pretty natural thing. So, what did it actually look like with the three-class voting system? They simply made a list of all taxable citizens, ordered by how much tax they pay, so that those who pay the most taxes are at the top, and the tax burden per person decreases as you go down. And now they simply count the person and their paid taxes until they reach 3 of the total tax revenue, meaning the total income of the state from taxes. And all the taxpayers they've counted up to that point belong to the first tax class. Then they continue, counting again until they reach 1/3 of the total tax revenue, and that gives them the second class. And then the third class is left over, and that also has to be 1/3 the total tax revenue. Now you can imagine, of course, since not everyone pays the same taxes, you don't end up with exactly 1/3 in terms of the number of taxpayers. So, actually, I wrote this down. It changes during the Second Empire, but essentially you have 4% of taxpayers falling into the first class, 16% in the second class, which makes a total of 20%, and that leaves 80% for the third class. And each class has the same voting rights. That means each class elects 6 electors. And that means, of course, that since there are significantly more people, significantly more legible voters in the third class, they have a correspondingly lesser influence on the outcome of the election. And it's quite specific. So, for example, in 1680, you can see that in the second class, each voter has only 1/4 of the voting power of the first class. And in the third class, it's even just 1/20. Or to put it another way, if everyone in the third class has 1 full vote, then those in the second class have 5 votes, and those in the first class have 20 votes. If you consider the taxes paid, they don't buy votes per tax. The third class is favored. They have 120 voting power, but pay 132 tax. Since 1871, Reichstag elections are equal voting, so taxes don't matter. No numbers needed. So they have 1/20 of the voting power but only pay an average of 1/32 of the tax. So, and now you know, the election to the Reichstag since 1871 is equal voting, meaning it doesn't matter what taxes you pay. You don't even need to have any numbers. I believe only those who received direct payments from the state were not allowed to vote. But that's obviously a big difference when suddenly, and all later voting rights are of course the same. At least for us. Equal voting rights mean that whether you pay 1 million marks in taxes or just 1 mark, you get 1 vote. And what is the first impression one gets when this change happens? When instead of the census voting system, voting is now done in equal terms according to this 3-class voting system. Well, one would initially say it's quite simple. The first class loses the most political power. They originally had 20 times that of the third class, but now they have significantly less, namely 1/20 each. And there are very few of them, which means their overall power is also low. Even if the entire first class votes for a party, it only adds up to 4%. So it's a splinter party. And the second class loses 5 times compared to the third class. Those are the 2 big losers. The first class loses the most, the second class also loses, and the third class wins. Why? Because they are 80% of the eligible voters. Then there are those who don't pay any taxes. They aren't considered in this voting system at all, so they aren't allowed to vote. But they already make up 80%, which means they always have a comfortable absolute majority. So, by their sheer numbers, they will win every election. So, the third class is the class that benefited the most from this reform, if you want to call it that. After 1918, this 3-class voting system no longer existed, and they are the ones who gained the most from it. And that's certainly true. Can't deny that. That's now 80%, this third class. And with that, they win every election. You can also see that in the concrete results. So parties like the SPD had no chance under the 3-class voting system. Also, voter turnout in the third class was much lower. And in the Reichstag, you can see how the SPD keeps gaining more leading up to World War I. And that's a correct observation. The third class is winning here. But what about the first 2 classes? Only the second class, yes, they are losing too. That's this 5-fold voting right of the third class. But the first class, what about these 4%? So the upper class, you could say, are they really losing as much political power as it seems here? Namely, their political power being limited to 1/20. And you can certainly feel that no, the rich are still influential today and can push through what we want in politics. And how does that happen? And what does that have to do with the implementation and change of this voting law? Well, who are they in the first class, the first tax bracket? These are large industrial entrepreneurs, bankers. 2021, these are very wealthy people with high incomes. Otherwise, they wouldn't be paying taxes. And that, of course, means that these are also people who have a strong political and social influence, even without going to the polls. So, if we move into modern times or today's world, the entrepreneur decides where to set up their business. They decide in which country to hire workers. The banks decide where the money flows go, and so on and so forth. So this first class is certainly not one that just says, oh, the voting rights have changed, we'll give up our entire sphere of political influence and retreat into our little think tanks. Of course not. Instead, they just find other ways, and they have the opportunity to take those other paths, and they know what it looks like today. In European legislation, it's rarely the politicians who make the laws anymore. It's some lobbyists who write it all up nicely, and the politician just has to put their signature underneath. So, lobbying is something that allows this first tax bracket, even though they no longer have direct political influence through elections, to still keep the state on a tight leash as much as they can. But the second class, the middle class, can't pull off something like that. 2021, they're doing okay. They can't engage in lobbying. So they don't have the option to offset the loss from the transition to the same voting rights like the first class. On the other hand, they are also not enough to let the mass effect play out in the same election. So, the second class is actually the one that loses when switching from a census voting system to a system of equal votes. The broad masses win because they can suddenly use their numbers. The elite wins. The elite doesn't necessarily win. The elite basically doesn't change their influence at all. It's the way they exert that influence. You also know that for about 100 years, there haven't been any political efforts from the big industrialists. That would be ridiculous. What kind of party is that supposed to be? At most 4% today, you can forget about that. On the contrary, these big companies, they know this. If they have customer contact, they always play the socialist card because they want to please 80% of the people. They are actually pure capitalists and ruthless in that regard. But in order to please the 80% and sell them all the nice things they produce, they have a pronounced divergence between what they actually do and what they promote. And that is a sign of this separation that is happening within society. The actual powerful positions are shifting from a certain middle ground to the outer extremes, namely the upper elite on one side and the broad masses on the other. And those are two completely opposing political movements. One movement is purely capitalist while the other is purely socialist. The broad masses will always be inclined towards socialism, while the upper class will always be capitalist. This connecting element of the middle class, of bourgeois society, has somewhat been lost. And they also see it quite practically from an economic perspective that a few of these middle class people are moving up to the upper class while the others are drifting down. This is the elephant curve phenomenon where, at least globally, the wages of the lower classes are actually rising and the rich are also getting richer. In fact, the wages and salaries of the average class or the middle bourgeoisie have been decreasing for decades. And that's exactly what I mean by culture and genius, with a cultic middle, the year 2001 in culture, and then the widening in genius. You can see this very clearly in Roman society. You know that during the Civil War, when the middle class of Roman citizens collapses, like the Roman farmer, who was doing fairly well, he falls down to the plebs. And also the Senate, at least the optimates, are being stripped of their power. These are the somewhat poorer senators. So the whole middle class is collapsing. And what's left are the populares, who then become emperors, and broad masses, who can be kept entertained with bread and circuses. And there you have this division of the emperor's broad masses. And before that, in the Republic, you had the middle ground, the plebeians, and the senatorial aristocracy, a bourgeois state. And of course, in the early days, the early genius, which was also spread out, only started to strive for the middle with the onset of the Republic, after the expulsion of the kings, when suddenly the previously advisory nobility of the Senate took over all the power. Shortly after, the plebeians are also raised into this influential class, and power concentrates in the middle. And later, in the same way, but completely symmetrically, it goes back to having emperors and the people again. And exactly this process is happening here with the dissolution of the census voting rights. At first glance, it seems like elite is simply being disempowered. The elite will never be disempowered. That's just not going to happen. The elite doesn't just have power because of a document, a constitution that states who has what voting rights. But the elite has power because they have capital, because they have real estate and so on. 2001. And they won't give that up. It's because the formal regulations of the election in a state look different. And that naturally corresponds with the feelings of today's people. Elections don't change anything. Well, yes, because the masses are, so to speak, the second component in politics. So you can't do it without the masses. The masses can, if necessary, stand in the streets. And on the other side, it's the elite. Who has really lost is this middle-class society. And that's why I refer to it as the cultic middle. This middle, this bourgeois society, the citizens of the city, the polis, these are the forces of culture. And when this middle class collapses, the culture collapses with it. And that's the effect they have here. Even though it looks like a purely just measure, the introduction of equal voting rights actually leads to the elimination of the moderator of the middle. And only the two extremes remain, the communist masses and the capitalist elite. That's why I say that these two always appear simultaneously. There is no communism without capitalism, and there is no capitalism without communism, while culture and civility are always linked to the market economy. Now, I don't want to go into what the difference is, but you can probably guess. And if you don't know right now what the chapter is called, Credit and Work, you can read about it there. So you see the essential components of our time, the feeling of socialist tendencies on one hand, and strong capitalist tendencies on the other, which are constantly clashing and meeting, creating friction and conflict. This polarization of society is, to a significant extent, part of the elimination of civility, which, when it still held a substantial part of power, acted as a kind of moderation for the whole situation. And that's exactly the effect of the 19th century or the early 20th century, as they want to see it. The apparent equal treatment of people ultimately leads to the actual Darwinian moments resurfacing when everyone is treated the same. So even though there is, of course, a progressive tax that already existed back then too, at least in the empire, where local taxes were also included. So if you treat all people equally, that naturally means that the effect of Hobbes comes back into play, which is that you have to band together to keep the strong in check. And you can already see that it leads to conflict. And those are exactly the conflicts that are happening today. And it's also the mental gap that we all have, where on one hand we think the welfare state is expanding and communist ideas are breaking through, while on the other hand, the actual economy, the real driving forces of society, are purely capitalist in nature, and that is far removed from the market economy. So market, in the sense, that in the polis there is a market, and there the citizens come together in person and trade with each other. No, unequal partners, but rather true equality, which is no longer present when you treat everyone equally. Instead, it results in the opposite effect. One thinks that by equal treatment, like in 2001, they can balance voting rights, but the opposite happens. The mass impoverishment and elite enrichment are results of this leveling. One thinks that by treating everyone equally in 2001, they can smooth out the inequalities in voting rights. But the opposite happens. The effect of the impoverishment of the masses and the enrichment of the elite are outcomes that arise precisely from this supposed leveling. That's an interesting effect, and above all, it's a very nice example of the widening gap emerging from the cultic center in a way that you wouldn't initially expect, since it's and this is also interesting, a linear measure. At first you have a sort of quadratic increase in voting power per class. So each class has, you could almost say, a voting power that's almost quadratic higher than the class before. And now they just say, I'm smoothing that out. That's a linear measure, where they say everyone now gets the same voting rights. So not just linear, it's constant when seen as a mathematical function. But the result of this linear measure is not linearity. Rather, the result is cyclicity. And that's the effect I often describe in culture and ingenuity, namely that things that seem to work linearly ultimately lead to cyclical behaviors when you look at them closely. That's also the reason so take the example of Roman citizenship. So initially there is of course no Roman citizenship in history, and then Roman citizenship is introduced. A small number of people have Roman citizenship in the city of Rome. Then you know it gets expanded during the Civil War to all of Italy, and later under Caracalla, the whole empire, everyone in the entire empire receives Roman citizenship. And at the moment when you have this linear expansion of citizenship, it always goes in one direction. More and more people get citizenship, but when everyone has Roman citizenship, then it's no longer special. Then it's as if they hadn't granted any citizenship at all. And that they are back at the starting point. That means the gradual, linear pursuit of a strategy in the same direction can ultimately bring you back to the starting point, 2001. And that's cyclicity, coming back to the starting point, like running in a circle. And something similar happens here, not in time, but in the estates. They introduce a linear right, a linear justice, and the result is actually a cyclical distribution of power. Cyclically in the sense of higher power among the masses, lower power among the middle class, and higher power at the top among the elite. So here you also have an example of this cyclicity arising from linearity. So those were two additions to my book again. But I think for everyone who doesn't know the book, it's an interesting consideration of who would have thought from the abolition of the 1,000, which is often portrayed as an unjust census voting right, a completely different outcome follows than one might have initially thought, namely this cyclicality. So cyclically in the estates, this widening of power in the estates from the central middle class to, let's say, the emperor and the people, the elite, 2001 and broader masses. That should be it for today. I hope you learned something interesting from that. Until next time, good night.